The conversation around AI has continued to skirt real issues that real human beings and creators are feeling and experiencing. I'm a big proponent of optimizing my life by finding ways to reduce friction in my environment and all those sorts of things. But I think we have taken things too far now that AI is a part of the picture. Of course, AI is extremely useful in a lot of its applications, and I use it frequently at my job. I'm an instructional designer, so we rely pretty heavily on AI tools. I'm not some Luddite or something like that. The stream of consciousness kind of popped up for me, and I was just taking notes about my observations around AI and how it's affecting us in our day-to-day lives. The three categories that I kind of want to talk about are our daily routines, the way that we communicate, and then lastly, creativity, of course. The first thing being routines. I personally have used AI to try to optimize my routines. For example, I have asked ChatGPT to help me figure out better approaches to my workouts, or how can I manage tasks more efficiently. And I don't think that there's anything that's like intrinsically or like inherently wrong with doing that, but I've noticed recently this sort of homogenization of all of the information that I receive from ChatGPT. So I'm always receiving the same sorts of suggestions, and I would have to imagine that just about everyone and anyone who's using the same tool for a similar task is receiving a very similar or like an adjacent output, which means if we're all trying to optimize certain parts of our lives and we're all getting the same outputs, it is resulting in a sort of flattening of our day-to-day experiences. There is this sort of predictability. Some of the terminology or like the language that these models are using are very consistent, right? Like delving into things, streamlining, efficiency. A lot of this kind of seeps into the next category that I'll talk about with communication. But to stay on track with routines, something that I think becomes a consequence of this reliance on AI is that we become more rigid in our day-to-day lives. If you are receiving advice, for instance, from a chatbot that's been trained on a bunch of very specific information from humans, and if the majority of people who are using something like ChatGPT are leveraging it for this like corporatization and enshittification that we're all constantly surrounded by, the routines or maybe the solutions that are suggested by something like ChatGPT are in a sense kind of like corporatizing our approach to our own lives. We can use these tools to optimize certain parts of our lives meaningfully, right? We want to reduce friction so that we can create space for the things that are truly meaningful to us. But on the other hand, if we're offloading our desires, if we're not checking in with ourselves and determining what we actually want from life, and we're getting some sort of to-do list spit back out at us from a machine, it flattens our capacity to experience a deeply meaningful life. Just generally, AI is, at its core, a tool that is used for cognitive offloading, which is essentially us outsourcing some sort of task to technology or whatever it might be. Like, for example, I write down my notes in a notebook. I am cognitively offloading so that I don't have to store all of that information in the forefront of my mind. So cognitive offloading is like neutral. It's not good or bad. However, in the context of AI, I feel like, based on my observations and my own experience using these tools, we are giving up a certain degree of our agency when we go to something like ChatGPT to try to optimize a routine or, integrate something new into our day-to-day life. I would say that of the three topics that I want to talk about today, the routines are the least concerning. I think as humans, it's good for us to have some sort of consistency in our day-to-day life so that we can achieve the things we want to. But with that, I think it's important to actually ask yourself, like, what do you want? Not what does a chatbot interpret me as wanting. The advice that we're receiving is coming from a thing, not a person. The next thing I've been thinking about that feels far more consequential is how AI is impacting language and the way that we communicate. One of the first things that I think of when I am considering communication and AI and their relationship is the movie Her. For those of you who haven't watched the movie Her, I highly recommend it because there's a lot of interesting parallels to some of the stuff that's happening presently with AI. If you haven't seen it, basically, the long story short, the main character works as like a letter writer. So he writes these thoughtful letters to people's family members, and he's more or less doing the emotional labor of others who have cognitively offloaded, like they need to write a love letter to their lover, or they need to write like a thoughtful card to someone whose family member died or something. And the movie is just sort of exploring our relationship and our reliance on technology. Just a spoiler alert, he falls in love with a chatbot, but she's polyamorous. What a lot of us are doing now is kind of similar to some of the themes in that movie. I will speak from my own experience. I was working on a project and I needed to have some sort of letter of recommendation for a fake company that I was writing a proposal for. I used ChatGPT to help me draft this fake referral because I didn't know what to write. And I would imagine that there are a number of people who actually have done this before for a real human being. Maybe they feel they're not a strong writer, or they don't have a ton of time to really think through what they want to write in a letter of recommendation or something to that effect. So they outsource that task to ChatGPT and they say, hey, write me a referral or a letter of recommendation for this person. Here's a couple of brief details. And then you just copy and paste and send it off. It strips away the human part that is most important to this whole process, right? If someone asks you to write them a letter of recommendation, they are hoping that you will actually put thought into it and like speak their praises so that they can get the job they want, or they can get, whatever it is that they're trying to attain. You could use ChatGPT to write a letter of recommendation that doesn't even really come across as personal. There's no real information in there that's relevant to the individual that like sets them apart from other candidates, let's say from like a job or something. And then like someone on the other end of that like will read it or skim it and be like, wow, what a lovely letter of recommendation. And it's funny to me that all this shit's just fake. It's all just nonsense for profit. We're all existing in this sort of like simulacra every day that we show up at our corporate jobs. Like we all are like, oh, just use ChatGPT. Like just don't do the work. Have the robot do the work for you. The next piece that I want to talk about in regard to communication is how we rely on these sort of like auto-completes and these suggestions. Sometimes when you're working in ChatGPT, it'll ask you what your preferred response is. So it'll generate 2 responses to the same prompt, and you can more or less like upvote which one you like better. And I think it just speaks to this weird fucking hyper reality that we're entrenched in right now, where we actively use something that is inhuman to solve a human problem. And then we vote on which response we prefer to make the robot seem more human. It's just very meta and very weird. Or even when you're texting, sometimes on my iPhone, it'll try to autocomplete or, pick the next word for me. All of these things seem relatively harmless when we consider them at face value, but there is a cost, and it is the flattening of our language. It is a decreased ability to articulate our thoughts in a unique and human way. And I also would argue that this is kind of like a side argument that I'm trying to work out still, but I believe that there is this sort of digital gentrification that occurs where the dominant culture prevails online. So a lot of voices are obscured, a lot of dialects are obscured. The slang or the verbiage that is used in those cultures or in those communities is completely eradicated by our technology. So we're all being homogenized in the way that we speak and the way that we write. And that has a huge impact on education, on people's ability to attain careers, things like that. It is so consequential. Where are we sourcing this sort of base data that ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and so forth are pulling from? Because if there is a homogenized voice that is providing the input to ChatGPT, for instance, then of course the output is going to be a very flattened version of the human experience. It is perhaps only highlighting certain voices. None of this is new. Like, we know that AI is very discriminatory. Communication can become sort of gentrified. And I think a piece of this, again, going back to that kind of corporatization, is that ChatGPT talks like a finance bro a lot of the time. If you really analyze the language and the choice of words, you might get a different flavor from these different LLMs and chatbot tools and things like that based on how you interact with them. Arguably, when I go on LinkedIn, for example, the worst place in the world, when I'm on LinkedIn, I see post after post that is very obviously written with ChatGPT, which is interesting because we're all able to identify that the same voice keeps coming up everywhere, and we're able to oftentimes detect when something is AI. Separate side tangent. I have been using M-dashes and lots of commas long before ChatGPT ever entered the conversation, and it is so frustrating that ChatGPT was trained on human data, and now we're being told that if you use M-dashes, somehow you use ChatGPT. It's just so frustrating. It's changing the way that we write, because now I find myself no longer using M-dashes out of fear that someone might think that I used an AI tool when in fact I am sharing an idea that came from my brain. Part of this flattening of language also results in a lack of empathy. Because if we cannot articulate our thoughts and our feelings in a human-centered way, it is going to be more difficult to understand and relate to other people who come to us with their humanness. That is deeply concerning to me, because our world is pretty fucked right now, and I think we are lacking empathy. Empathy has this bad reputation because of stupid tech bros who are afraid of their own feelings. We are offloading so much to AI tools that our ability to communicate effectively has been stripped. This next piece kind of touches on some of the creativity part as well, which I'll dig further into in just a second here. But another part here is I think we end up questioning our own ability to communicate. I have been there, and I'm sure a number of you have been there. You have to draft a really important email to someone who you're kind of intimidated by, who maybe has a say in whether or not you get to keep your job. And you want to make sure you sound professional and respectful. And you ask ChatGPT to help you edit your email. This, again, is not inherently bad, but when I think about why I do something like that, it stems from self-doubt. It stems from a feeling that I am inadequate, or that my humanness is not exceptional enough, that I need something not human, something outside of myself to modulate the way that I choose to use language so that I am perceived in a different way. Weird. Very simulacra. You might be emailing back and forth with somebody for days about something really important, and for all you know, both parties involved are just using ChatGPT to draft those emails, and it could be about a very human issue. So interesting stuff to just consider. This brings me to the last kind of category for now that I want to talk about, which I am always talking about, which is creativity. To piggyback off of what I was just saying about this erosion of confidence as we rely more and more heavily on AI tools, I think it is only appropriate to talk about creativity and the way that we compare ourselves to standards that are impossible in our day-to-day lives. Of course, as a woman, I am all too familiar with the idea of impossible standards. There are fake accounts of people who are literally just AI people. And this is influencing the standard of what we think we're supposed to look like or how we're supposed to behave in the world. And with that is imposter syndrome and comparison to others and all of these heavy, complicated things. If you are an artist and you're seeing endless AI art on your social media feeds and things like that, maybe you start to feel like there's no point in even creating. Oh, I can just type a prompt and out comes a complete piece of art, if you will, a complete image or a complete graphic or whatever. That can feel really degrading and can make us question our own value, because we have this sort of inbuilt assumption that these technologies are smarter than we are. And that is wrong. I just want to make it abundantly clear in case you're questioning yourself. You have your own unique intrinsic capacity to feel and to understand context and nuance and culture. And there are things that you perceive that ChatGPT never can or never will. I mean, maybe one day, I don't know. Hopefully not. It'd be creepy. It is so easy to compare ourselves to things that we see online, even when they're not AI generated. It's hard enough knowing that everything could be photoshopped to oblivion, let alone throwing in AI to the mix. I think it is important that we really ask ourselves why we are using AI to support our creativity when we choose to. Maybe you're a writer and there are instances where you need help shoring up an idea, so you use something like ChatGPT. And I don't always think that it's wrong to use AI. Like, there's a producer named Rob Clough, and he has trained AI to incorporate into his music production in a very interesting way. And I would say that that is a use of AI for a creative venture that I support. I think is creative and beautiful and interesting. I, however, have talked extensively in other videos about the instances where, people making the stupid starter packs, the AI reproductions of things like the Studio Ghibli aesthetic. That shit pisses me off. Like, that's not cool. But I think we need to just check in with ourselves, right? Like, if you feel inclined to use an AI tool to enhance your creative process, that's not necessarily always a bad thing, but you need to ask yourself if it's coming from a place of self-doubt or if it's because the AI is an integral part to whatever you're trying to communicate. I think my biggest problem with AI in the context of creativity is that oftentimes we're outsourcing the idea generation phase of creativity. I think one of the most important parts of creating something impactful and interesting is being sparked or inspired by an idea that you want to chase down to the end. And if you don't have an idea and choose to outsource the task of finding inspiration by just asking a chatbot to do it for you, there is a reduction of our humanity that I think is worth questioning. Part of the beauty of creating something is interacting with an idea. The things that inspire you or encourage you to create or spark you and give you that feeling that like, oh, I need to chase this. I need to create something from this input. If I'm going to continue using my own language from past videos. If I'm going to run with this input, it's going to be exciting because it's something I actually care about. Whereas if you ask a chatbot to conjure ideas for you, are you really that interested in even creating the thing that it tells you to create? This isn't to say that inspiration can't be birthed from something like AI. This isn't to say that you couldn't be well-intentioned by seeking an idea by having a conversation with AI. That's not what I'm saying. Just to be clear, there is so much nuance to this whole discussion about AI tools and how we implement them, especially in creative fields. But I do think going outside and encountering nature or having conversations with other humans or reading books or listening to music or looking at art, all of these things can spark inspiration for us because we're receiving an input and interpreting it through our filters. That right there is what often will ignite a passion or ignite this feeling that we have to spontaneously grab an idea and make it something tangible. When we offload the cognitive labor that is finding inspiration, that is feeling the experience of inspiration and translating it into an idea, we are actually omitting a key aspect of our creativity from the entire process. Okay, so I've said a lot. I've touched on a lot of ideas, and some of it's kind of disparate, and like I said, I'm just sort of piecing these thoughts together as they come. I was sitting at my desk earlier, and all of these things just sort of flooded my mind. So I just jotted a bunch of notes down, and here I am now sharing it with you. So my hope is that some of this makes sense. The final piece to all of this that I want to address is the environmental implications of relying so heavily on AI and technology in general. There are so many studies out there talking about the impacts of using artificial intelligence in our day-to-day life, how much water it requires, how much electricity it requires, and so on and so forth. I think if our goal is to optimize, we need to ask ourselves, how the fuck is it optimal to utilize resources that we all need to survive and thrive on this planet, that other species need to survive and thrive on this planet, how is it an optimal condition to use those resources to outsource our humanness, to streamline our seamless capacity to create more shareholder value? Because at the end of the day, this whole idea of optimization and this whole idea of being more efficient is imposed upon us by this corporatocracy. So I will leave you with that. I know this video was a little bit more philosophical and maybe a little heavier than some of my recent stuff, but I think it's important that we talk about this because it's on top of mind for a lot of people. And how are we going to navigate this moving forward if we don't have an open dialogue about it? As always, these are just my thoughts. Again, this is just like a stream of consciousness ramble. I really appreciate you clicking on this video. And if you watched this far, thank you so much. You made it this far, so you might as well hit the subscribe button. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Bye. Bye, 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 bye.